Um, we had, with this tradition, we kind of were playing with it, see what would happen. And so we set up the royal family nativity scene. And then off here, quite a ways away, we set up the camels and the wise men. And perhaps hoping that people would see that the distance away between the two of them also reflected distance of time between the two events. I got into a lot of trouble for that. That's not how it goes, Pastor. And yet the scriptures say. But to some degree, it's perhaps a tradition that I don't know. Is it that big of a thing to try to say, well, actually, what happened was, or is it enough of a lighthearted concept to that keeping the two together is really not going to break the bank concepts? What do you think? Do we separate the two, or do we keep them together? July. Right? So, this is perhaps one of the fun traditions that we have regarding this whole thing. That perhaps we all have stories that are going to relate to it, that makes us chuckle perhaps. And more so than even any of the traditions, I think that is what is so fun and awesome about the scriptures, is that for every story, if you will, in the scriptures, there always seems to be some kind of humorous memory. Maybe it's not so good of a memory. Maybe it's but regardless, the memory recalls us to the scriptures. And I think the unique thing about that is that whether it's a good memory, a bad memory, or somewhere in between, God is still pointing us to the scriptures. What happened? And especially in contexts like an adult Bible study, when we are able to go and research the scriptures and to study the scriptures and find out what actually happens. And in chapter 2, verse 1, now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, that word behold is a word that I want to talk about for a moment. Because it seems like a small word, whether in English or in the Greek. It's a word that maybe, I don't know, doesn't seem to pack a lot of punch. Now, I have the ESV version. I'm curious, what other versions do we have out there? NIV maybe, King James? What word does it say? Okay, the King James you said? No, NIV. So NIV seems to go with just simply he asked. What other translations do we have? Behold? All right. Another way that you could translate that Greek word is to simply say, look. In other words, it is a word of exclamation almost. A word that captures your attention. It says, hey, look over there. And everybody looks over there, and then something over there happens, right? Talk about the wise men or the magi coming from the east, and we got lots of things that are going to go into this. But they're coming from the east, and if Bethlehem and Jerusalem is in kind of that Holy Land area, which I said kinda and if. This is an actual thing. Jerusalem and Bethlehem is in the Holy Land, in the Middle East. And so if it's talking about the East, we're perhaps talking about India/China area. Though at that time, maybe it was called different things. I don't know. But these men coming from the east see up into the sky a new star, if you will. It held them. It caused them to look. It caused them to, hey, wait a minute, that's a new star. What's this all about? And in their research, their search for a meaning, it physically led them to go to Bethlehem. Now, being wise men, being magi, being scholarly people, that seems to be the concept of what is describing these men, these individuals. They did their research and they found out, what is this star supposed to mean? What is it supposed to represent? What is it supposed to do? When you find something new, unique, out of the ordinary, don't you start asking yourselves those various questions of who, what, where, when, why, and how? To try to I've never seen that before. What's that all about? Yeah? And in their research, they found out, from whether they were researching the Old Testament, whether they were researching more secular archives or whatever, they found that they needed to go to Bethlehem to find one that would be born King of the Jews. Now, we don't have perhaps a lot of information, but one thing that we have to start to question or speculate upon is what kind of knowledge did they have? To borrow a term that'll come later, are these wise men Christian? Are they non-Christian? The word that they use here, they say that we come to worship. In almost every mainstream translation, it says worship. But the word could also mean simply reverence. The text says that when they saw Jesus, they bowed down. Are they showing respect and honor to this child that they had a firm belief in was supposed to be somebody important? Or are they worshiping him as the Son of God, not really knowing that he would eventually be the Son of God yet? You could argue both ways, but the text seems to indicate that they have more of this, what we might call natural knowledge of God, that you look out the window and you see trees and clouds and grass and animals and people and cars and everything else, and you're led to think, well, all that had to come from somewhere, and so you start that endless cycle. Well, trees come from an acorn, or at least oaks do, right? And, well, where'd the acorn come from? It came from another tree. Well, that came from and you go back far enough to, when did the first acorn come? And then you start asking that old joke of what came first, the chicken or the egg? And you have heard as many answers to that as anybody. Although, if you'll excuse my tandem, or my, whatever that word is, tangent, Kai and I were in the Burger King drive-thru line years ago, as we usually find ourselves. And we are right up at the window getting ready to receive our food and so forth. And it was on my side of the car, but on the right side was a fairly busy street. And Kyle looked out and she started whapping on my shoulder. I look and there's a chicken crossing the road. And so now, and we're both kind of going, and the lady in the window was looking, it's like, there's a chicken. So now our answer to that joke is always, why did the chicken cross the road? To get to Burger King. And the beauty of tangents is that you don't remember where you were at before you went on the tangent. So this whole idea of the wise men looking up into the night sky, seeing a new star, a new bright light, wondering what is it all about? Which brings in a fair amount of what I call journalistic questions as well. My experience with astronomy, astronomical concepts, is that if it's bright enough, you'll see it during the day. Sometimes you see the moon up there, right? Sometimes you might see a star. But otherwise, during the day is fairly limited in what you might actually see. It's actually at night when you see stars and comets and moon and everything else. So, when did these wise men travel? Did they travel just at night? And then, when during the day they slept, and then when the stars came out, they readjusted their course direction of making sure that they're still on the right path? How about when did they start? Text here says in verse 3 it is, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. No, that's not the verse I wanted. Anyway, this whole verse about Herod killing all the boys 2 years and younger. Does that indicate that these wise men first saw this star, whatever it is, 2 years ago? And they've been traveling for upwards to 2 years? Did King Herod, right? Maybe, maybe not. Yeah? And was Herod just saying, okay, we don't know exactly how old this little one is, but just in case, 2 years is our cutoff limit. So they're traveling from the east. They're walking. Perhaps they ride their camels a little bit, but even still, they're not going all that fast. So to get from wherever they started to Bethlehem, and they first went to Jerusalem because they would have had to talk to King Herod and so forth, and then they were told to go to Bethlehem, which was another 5 miles. When you think of how far they've come already, 5 miles probably wasn't that big a deal for them. And they probably thought nothing of it. But yet to go from wherever they started to Jerusalem, it's not exactly on the interstate. And they don't exactly have a minivan or any other vehicle. So they could have taken the northern route to get around the desert. They could have gone several different options. And yet, so it took a while to get from point A to point B, perhaps upwards to 2 years. So they're following this star, and in that itself, there is a variety of questions that we already kind of talked about, day versus night. What is this star? Was, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, we went to, planetarium, is that the right word? Here in Huntsville. And there's this great, big, huge screen that took up most all of the one wall. I can't think of the word of what that's called. I don't know. But it was specifically on the Star of Bethlehem. Maybe some of you saw it. But, and so in that movie, quite interesting, they tried to figure out what this star was. And they were looking at, concepts of astronomy, context of astrology, concepts of the scriptures itself. Was it a natural occurring phenomena? Was it an alignment of all the planets? Convergence, I think, is the word they use for that. Was it a supernova? Was it more of what we might call a regular nova? Was it a comet, an asteroid? And they went through more of a scientific explanation of why it could have been that and why it probably more than likely was not. And it seemed to, why it was not seemed to, disagree with me if I'm getting this wrong, but that it seemed to be very erratic, this star moving across the heavens and leading them, but yet it seemed to be very precise. And so the length of time that convergence of planets or whatever it was would have taken did not seem to fit the length of time that the wise men needed to travel to Jerusalem and ultimately to Bethlehem. So if it isn't a natural occurring thing, we must then assume that it's whatever the opposite of natural, unnatural, supernatural occurrence. And so then if it's a supernatural occurrence, then we are looking at the realm of faith, perhaps, of what's going on, what's happening. And so the other thought process that seems to at least be curious in my mind is this idea of, all right, so there's a big star up there, a big bright light, whatever it is, natural or supernatural, and I'm going this way. When do you know when to stop? When do you know, like, right there, that's your spot. That's where you want to go. Maybe you need to go another 100 miles that way. And so this perhaps leads, at least in my mind, a little bit more to the idea of a supernatural or a God thing, as Dr. Bells would call it, and say that this star specifically led the wise men to that spot. First to Jerusalem, and then finally to Bethlehem. In my mind, again, if you go by science, that's probably not the best answer, but I'm going by faith, and so that's the answer I'm going to go with, that it's a God thing. God had a design and a purpose for his plan of salvation. There's texts in the Old Testament as far back as Numbers, and maybe even further back than that, of there being a star that would appear out of the east that the wise men would eventually follow. Jesus oftentimes, even though in the Old Testament he's not called Jesus, he's usually the angel of the Lord or the Lord or second person of the Trinity, which is a modern day designation of who he is. But he's often referred to as the bright morning star. And so we haven't seen the star since. Naturally occurring phenomena up there usually is repeatable. And isn't that what science is all about? Is something's going to happen more than once on a normal occurrence. It's been a while since I've had 9th grade science, so any of you scientists who can explain it better, please feel free to. Yeah.
So if you're looking at it that way,
Yeah.
That's the way I would look
Yeah.
at it. So to me, if this star came out and pointed him to the Savior, it was a God thing, and it was in the same spot all the time.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they never would have got there,
Yeah.
unless they were really wise and started triangulating on something.
Yeah. It hit all
The
the.
North Star is the only one that really doesn't move. But we went. My question is.
Marcia goes, oh boy, here we go again.
She's rolling her eyes, and I'm not even looking at her. Says the Magi came from the east. They wanted to know who was born king of the Jews. We saw his star in the east. So they were in the east, saw his star in the east. How did they get to the west? Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, you know, I mean, we got Bethlehem over here, and we got the east over here.
Yeah.
And they were in the east, saw the star east.
So they should have gone the long way around.
Well, they should have went to Japan and Alaska and down, you know, I mean, they.
Yeah. 2 years, remember?
Yeah, I don't know anything about this stuff. So that's, you know, that's the only thing I have a little, I wonder, is there something in the translation that's just the way it shakes out?
Yeah, it might be the translation, because it says that they went on their way, the star they had seen when it rose, went ahead of them until it stopped over the place of the southwest. So, in my opinion, it's a very supernatural event.
Oh, yeah.
People that have studied, you know, the Nazareth and studied whether or not there's this star that's been, there's only one of these
It's those constellations.
right,
They rotate
and that's what,
everything.
yeah, that's what I mean. That's why I feel like it has to be supernatural.
Oh, I'm not saying it's not supernatural. In fact, I vote for that 100%.
Sure.
Yeah, well, that's
Maybe
not
what
the
they
east.
meant by in the east is that
Yeah.
they were in the east and
But
they
they
saw
came
it
from the
above them in the east.
Says that right there. Yeah,
might
well,
get it
mine
straight.
does.
And like
Yeah.
everybody else.
Yeah, so like, and constellations moved, so they followed it, so they, I thought the interesting thing though about when we went to the planetarium that they pointed out is, that's all people did back then. They didn't have TV, they didn't have cell phones, they looked at the stars, and so one of the things that the historians look at about that star is, you'll be able to find it in other historical
Yeah.
texts, because they wrote these things down all the time. If there was something interesting, it got documented, and so they struggled to find out, they said, well, this happened, but why didn't anyone, like, or if this happened, like, this would be a really good thing that they might have followed, but why wouldn't have anyone else written it down? Did God hide it from the others? Like, it's so puzzling as to why, I mean, we believe the scriptures overall, but then to try and find it somewhere else made it a little trickier for them.
Indeed. Miss Cat.
You know, the Bible says that God named every star, and and our, you know, Adam, Eve, everybody has so much more knowledge than we have, and there is history documentation about how, you know, Daniel brought a lot of information with him, and a lot of the astronomy in the East, they cite Enoch and Daniel as far as, you know, this came from Enoch and Daniel. So a lot of information was given verbally, and it was like they watch the stars much more than we do.
Yeah.
You know? And so I think there's just a lot being lost that they have that information like that.
Sure. Well, and all this is starting to lead us to the next curiosity that I have. You know, when I look into the heavens at night and see the stars, my guess is I'm seeing the same stars that everybody else in their northern hemisphere is looking at. People in Australia might be looking at different stars, but they're in the southern hemisphere. So these wise men in the east are looking up and they see this new star, and they find themselves going towards that new star. Are they the only ones that can see it? When you take a look at Matthew chapter 2 here, in verse 2 here, saying, "Where is he who has been born, King of the Jews?" So the Magi are talking to Herod now. "For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, tells me that this is all new to him. And if the idea is that they don't have social media and Disney Plus and all these other things to occupy their evening attention, and they are outside using, whether they knew it or not, their God-given imaginations and having their own form of Star Trek as they watch the trek of the stars across the night sky, wouldn't Herod have already saw this star and, hey, what's that all about? But our text seems to indicate that he had no prior knowledge, that his first time to know about this star was when he talked to the wise men.
It wasn't necessarily the star that troubled him. It was the new king of the Jews that troubled him.
Indeed. Indeed. So he's both wrestling through his mind that, one, there's a star thing, but two, what does that star mean? The wise men, who Herod probably would have recognized as being wise men, much like when we refer or are talking to somebody who has their PhD or something, we like, oh, you must actually have a brain cell or two. And so we, if only in our mind, we give to that individual the respect that he or she has earned by studying for that extra degree. And so Herod, my guess, is thinking the same thing about these guys, that they know what they're talking about. But so then the idea that they're looking for one that's going to be born king of the Jews, Herod's going, hey, wait a minute, that's my people. That's my spot. I'm king of the Jews. I've killed off family members, I've killed off relatives, I've killed off other people so that I can remain king of the Jews. Now you guys are telling me there's another person? I want to know so I can go take care of this individual. And eventually we're going to get to what a lot of people refer to as what's my phrase here? I thought I'd written it down. Must be on my other sheet. The holy innocents, the 2-year-old boys and younger who are killed off. A lot of people refer to them as some of the very first martyrs. That, I mean, if you get into the specifics of what a martyr is, excuse me, you can start to argue for and against that thought as well, which people have done for centuries. But when you take a look at these two kings, you got King Herod on one hand, and you got Jesus, King Jesus, if you will, on the other hand. King Herod is established. He's already king. He's already powerful. He's got armies at his command. He's got money, resource, power, fame, title. Then if you take a look at Jesus, he's an infant. He's born in a backwater village. It's a village of the principality, of the kingdom, but other than that, nothing to distinguish it from anything else. He doesn't have the lineage to, or Herod doesn't at least think he has the lineage to back up anything. If you take a look at the scriptures, you could find a lineage going all the way back to King David, but I don't know as though that King Herod the Great here would have really cared about that.
Would he have even known?
Known about what?
I mean, would Herod have even known about Christ if the three wise men
Probably not. I mean, if he was out walking on the sidewalk per se, or in his whatever those things are that you always see in the movies, whether the individual is in it, there's a cute little boy, but other than that, probably not. Yeah. And so consulting the chief priests and scribes and so forth, he probably got, oh, this is actually a little one that I should be paying attention to. Because there's words like king and ruler and lord and all those things that directly threaten my power and authority. But I doubt there would have been any attention given to this might be an actual king of the Jews, an actual God, an actual deity. And that brings us perhaps to a thought for the Magi. They probably didn't have a whole big distinction between royalty and deity. And so they were doing their due diligence to check in with Herod, who was the established ruler of the country. And by established, I mean he was more or less appointed by the Romans to be king, rather than, in those days it seemed to be that you became king because your dad was king type of concepts. And Herod seems to have been appointed by the Romans. And I have in my study note, I underlined it, named king of Judea by the Roman Senate in 40 BC. And so, as you recall, dating before Jesus is born is BC, and it's going to go 40, 39, 38, 37. And once Jesus is born, then numbers, ascend 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth, until we get to 2023, right? And next year, 2024, and so forth. So there is perhaps all kinds of mystery surrounding this text. What is that star? What does it mean? Was it natural, supernatural? The Magi coming from the east, westerly, however that happens, if they went the long way or the short way.
Yeah, I think that stuff is nice to talk about. But if we live too much in that arena, we miss the big picture. I mean, it's nice,
Yeah, if we break the forest down for the trees, sometimes it's hard to see the forest again. Indeed. And so perhaps when we put the trees back together into a forest, we see this God thing, that this is part of God's plan of salvation all the way since Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, very first gospel proclamation where God says, and this is my words, but God says, I'm going to send you a Savior. The Savior nobody knew it yet, but the Savior just got on the scene. It says Mary pondered all these things in her heart, and so maybe sometimes wonder, okay, what actually did Mary know? Was she doing the woman thing and pondering everything because it's a baby? Look, all these people are coming to see the baby. This is my baby. She's adding in the idea that, it's immaculate conception, virgin birth, and going, what in the world does that mean? That doesn't seem to be the way Mom taught me about these things. She talked to an angel. That doesn't happen all that often. And so you really start to wonder. But just like when we opened up this morning, everything points us back to the Scriptures, back to God, to see that forest and to see Okay, these are some fun thoughts, but let's keep that in perspective of what the bigger picture is. That Jesus, now born, King of the Jews, however big he was, in 30-some years, he's going to eventually be on that cross. And the plan of salvation, in a sense, will be completed. Although Dr. Vels again would say, no, the plan of salvation is not done until ascension and the Holy Spirit is sent back and so forth. So depending upon how you want to argue that calendar, I guess, huh? So, but anyway, we are at that time. Any last second questions, comments, thoughts? All right, let's close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven. All right, thank you for coming, and Happy New Year.